I hid cameras from my paralyzed mother-in-law. Watching her dance while draining my savings with my husband changed everything. Later, the cops revealed the sick truth. My name is Caroline. I am 37 years old, and for the longest time, I thought I was the luckiest woman in the world, simply because someone chose to keep me. You see, when you grow up bouncing around the foster care system, moving from one temporary house to another with your entire life stuffed into 2 garbage bags, you develop a very specific kind of hunger. It is not a hunger for food, but a starvation for permanence. For family. So, when I met Carter 9 years ago, I didn't just fall in love with him. I fell in love with the idea of being rooted. He was 39, charming, steady, and most importantly, he came with a mother. Doris. Doris was 68, and to me, she was the mother I never had. We baked together, we shopped together, and she called me her own daughter. I was so desperate to be loved unconditionally that I ignored every tiny, almost invisible red flag over the years. I built a highly successful career as a freelance financial consultant, working strictly from home, bringing in a very comfortable 6-figure income. I thought I was building our fortress. But 2 years ago, our perfect little world supposedly collapsed. Doris suffered a severe stroke. That is what the doctors told us at the time, or at least, that is what Carter told me after rushing her to a specialist in another state while I stayed behind to prep our home. When they returned, Doris was paralyzed from the waist down. Suddenly, my house smelled faintly of antiseptic wipes and lavender baby powder. The living room was rearranged to accommodate a massive hospital bed. And I, without a single moment of hesitation, stepped up. Friends and neighbors would stop by, pat my shoulder, and say things like, "Oh, Caroline, you are an absolute angel. You are a saint for doing this." But I did not feel like a saint. I felt like a daughter doing her duty. My daily routine became a grueling marathon. I would wake up at 5 in the morning to the piercing beep of her medical monitors. I would sponge bathe her, carefully rolling her heavy, dead weight from side to side, constantly terrified I might hurt her. I would dress her, brush her hair, and feed her pureed meals while managing my corporate clients on my laptop. The physical toll was devastating. By the end of the first year, I had developed chronic lower back spasms. There were nights I would lie awake in bed, tears quietly soaking my pillow, while my muscles practically screamed in agony. But every time I looked at Doris, sitting helplessly in her wheelchair, her face drooping in a practiced look of pure misery, my heart would break all over again. I would swallow some pain pills, plaster a smile on my face, and ask her if she needed anything else. I absorbed the exhaustion, the isolation, and the complete loss of my personal life because I believed this was what real families did. They sacrificed. They stayed. But a saint is just a martyr who hasn't realized she is dead yet. And I was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Love is incredibly expensive, both emotionally and literally. But when you love someone, you don't keep a ledger. At least, I didn't. The financial drain began almost immediately after the stroke. Carter sat me down at the kitchen table one rainy Tuesday, rubbing his tired eyes, and laid out a stack of medical bills. He told me that Doris's insurance was refusing to cover the specialized physical therapy and the custom-built, motorized wheelchair she desperately needed to prevent pressure sores. He looked completely defeated. He said it would cost tens of thousands of dollars out of pocket. I didn't even blink. I had an emergency savings account that I had been building since I was 22, a safety net for the rainy days I always feared would come. I drained half of it that very afternoon. But that wasn't enough for the top-tier equipment Carter insisted she needed. I had exactly one item of real value from my past, a vintage gold ring with a small ruby, the only thing I had left of my biological mother. I pawned it the next day. I handed the cash over to Carter, telling him to get Doris whatever she needed. He cried, hugged me tight, and told me I was his hero. Over the next 18 months, the dynamic of our household shifted entirely. Because I was so overwhelmed with caring for Doris and keeping my freelance consulting business afloat, Carter slowly took over the management of all our household finances. It started innocently enough. He would say, "Honey, you look exhausted. Let me pay the utility bills this month." Then it was, "Let me manage the grocery budget so you don't have to stress." Eventually, he had all my passwords. He linked my business accounts to our joint checking to make paying for Doris's in-home nurses easier. Nurses, by the way, who rarely seemed to show up because there was always some scheduling conflict, leaving me to do all the heavy lifting. I trusted him completely. I would deposit my large consulting checks, and the money would just evaporate into the endless void of medical expenses, copays, and out-of-network therapy sessions. I was working 60 hours a week, sleeping 4 hours a night, and serving as a full-time medical aide. My world shrunk to the four walls of our house. I stopped looking at bank statements. I stopped asking questions because Carter always seemed so stressed and appreciative. I was literally funding my own physical and mental collapse, writing the checks for the very chains that bound me to that house. But people who are busy surviving rarely have the energy to realize they are being hunted. But no matter how tired you are, the human brain is wired to notice inconsistencies. It started with small, almost imperceptible shifts in the atmosphere of our home. Carter began coming home from work later and later. He claimed he was taking extra shifts to help with the bills, but when he leaned in to kiss my cheek at midnight, he didn't smell like a man who had been grinding at an office. He smelled faintly of expensive cologne and, occasionally, stale craft beer. When I asked him about it, he would snap at me, telling me I was being ungrateful for his hard work. Then there was Doris. For a woman who was supposedly completely paralyzed and weak, she had moments of shocking vitality. I would walk toward her bedroom with a fresh cup of tea, and I would hear her talking on the phone. Her voice would be sharp, clear, and full of energy. But the second my footsteps creaked on the hardwood floor outside her door, the conversation would abruptly end. When I walked in, she would be slumped in her chair, her voice a fragile, trembling whisper. I convinced myself I was just hearing things. But the physical evidence became impossible to ignore. One morning, while I was trying to adjust her position in the bed, she lost her balance. Without thinking, her hand shot out and clamped down on my wrist to steady herself. Her grip was like a steel vise. It was so forceful, so incredibly strong, that it brought tears to my eyes. When I pulled away, there were 4 distinct, dark purple fingerprints bruised into my skin. Stroke victims with severe nerve damage do not have the grip strength of an athlete. That evening, I showed the bruises to Carter. I was crying, not just from the pain, but from the deep, terrifying confusion settling in my stomach. I asked him if it was possible she was recovering, if her muscles were having spasms. Carter didn't look at the bruises. He looked at me with a cold, flat expression I had never seen in 9 years. He stepped close, crowding my space, and said in a low, harsh tone, "Caroline, you are sleep-deprived and paranoid. She can't even stand. She is a cripple. Stop making everything about you and stop imagining things." The sheer aggression in his voice was like a bucket of ice water over my head. He wasn't concerned. He was defensive. And right then, the fragile illusion of my happy family cracked wide open. He used the word cannot. But my bruised wrist told a different story. The seed of doubt is a terrifying thing. Once it is planted, it grows roots in every thought, every memory, and every interaction. For 3 days after the bruising incident, I moved through the house like a ghost. I played my role perfectly. I smiled, I cooked, I lifted, and I agreed with everything Carter said. But my mind was racing. I started analyzing everything. The way Doris's supposedly dead legs never showed signs of severe muscle atrophy. The way the expensive physical therapists Carter claimed to hire always came while I was locked in my office on mandatory client conference calls. Driven by a gut feeling that made my hands shake, I waited until Carter took Doris out for what he called a routine hospital checkup. As soon as his car pulled out of the driveway, I logged onto my computer, used a private browser, and ordered 4 microsecurity cameras with next-day shipping. I paid for them with a prepaid gift card I had received from a client months ago, ensuring no transaction would ever hit the bank statements Carter monitored so closely. When the tiny, matte black lenses arrived, My stomach was in tight knots. I felt an overwhelming wave of guilt. I was invading the privacy of my husband and my sick mother-in-law. What if I was wrong? What if I was actually losing my mind from the stress, just like Carter said? I stood in the living room holding the cameras, feeling sick to my stomach. But then my thumb brushed against the fading purple bruises on my wrist. The guilt vanished, replaced by cold resolve. I hid the first camera inside the hollowed-out base of a fake potted fern near the television, giving it a sweeping view of the living room and the kitchen. I tucked the second one high up on a bookshelf in the hallway, aimed directly at Doris's bedroom door. The third went into the dining room chandelier, and the fourth was discreetly mounted behind a decorative plate in the kitchen. They were motion-activated, connected to a secure cloud server, and completely invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. I synced the feeds to a hidden app on my phone, buried inside a folder labeled tax documents. When Carter and Doris returned that evening, the trap was set. I served them pot roast, poured them wine, and waited. I didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, Carter announced he was going out to a local sports bar to watch a game with some guys from the office. He kissed my forehead, told me to make sure his mother took her evening medication, and walked out the door. The house grew quiet. Doris was supposedly asleep in her wheelchair in the living room facing the television. I retreated to my home office, locked the door, brewed a cup of tea, and pulled out my phone. My hands were trembling so badly I almost dropped the device. I opened the app and tapped on the living room feed. The video quality was crystal clear. For the first 10 minutes, nothing happened. Doris just sat there, staring blankly at the screen. I started to let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. Maybe I was crazy. And then she moved. It wasn't a twitch. It wasn't a painful, agonizing struggle. Doris reached down, unbuckled the safety strap of the expensive motorized wheelchair, and stood up. She stood up in one fluid, effortless motion. She planted both feet firmly on the ground, stretched her arms high above her head, and rolled her shoulders back. She walked. No, she didn't just walk. She practically strutted into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and pulled out a slice of leftover cake. My heart completely stopped. I couldn't breathe. The air in my office felt like thick mud. But the visual shock was nothing compared to what happened next. The front door opened on the camera feed. It was Carter. He hadn't gone to a sports bar at all. He walked into the kitchen, saw his mother standing there eating cake, and he didn't scream. He didn't rush to support her. He laughed. I turned the volume up on my phone, pressing the speaker against my ear. The audio was clear. God, my back is killing me sitting in that damn chair all day, Doris complained, her voice strong and robust. Carter chuckled, opening a beer. Just hold on a little longer, Mom. You're doing great. The act is totally worth it. I miss wearing my heels, she whined, leaning against the counter, crossing her supposedly paralyzed legs. How much longer are we going to milk her? She's getting annoying. Carter took a sip of his beer and smiled a smile that made my blood turn to ice. Not long. I'm almost done draining the business accounts into the offshore trust. We just need to keep her playing nurse until April 5th, 2026. That's when the massive mutual fund matures. Once I transfer that, we close on the new house in Florida, and we leave her with nothing but the lease on this apartment. Doris laughed, a high, mocking sound. She is so stupid, Carter. She actually cried when she sold that ugly ring of her mother's for my chair. Carter shrugged. Hey, I needed that cash for the down payment. She's a good little workhorse. Just keep playing sick, and let me handle the dumb wife. I sat staring at the black screen of my phone long after they moved out of the camera's frame. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't throw my cup of tea against the wall. The betrayal was so massive, so absolutely absolute, that it bypassed my emotions entirely and short-circuited my brain. It felt as if someone had surgically removed my heart and replaced it with a block of dry ice. I sat there in the dark and performed an autopsy on my 9-year marriage. Every kiss, every anniversary dinner, every late-night conversation about our future. It was all a meticulously crafted lie. Carter hadn't married me because he loved me. He married me because I was an orphan with severe abandonment issues and a high earning potential. I was the perfect, desperate mark. And Doris wasn't the mother I never had. She was a predator wearing a sweet old lady's mask, perfectly willing to watch me destroy my spine and my savings for her comfort. I rewound the footage. I watched Doris stand up again. I watched Carter laugh again. I listened to them mock the memory of my dead mother's ring. Over and over. I watched it until the shock wore off and the rage set in. But it wasn't a hot, explosive rage. It was cold. It was the kind of rage that makes your mind terrifyingly sharp. They thought I was weak. They thought because I was kind, because I served them, that I was stupid. They needed a nurse and a bank, and they thought I would just sit there and let them bleed me dry until April 5th, 2026. I stood up from my desk. My back still ached, my wrists still throbbed, but I felt a terrifying sense of clarity. If I confronted them now, if I walked out there screaming, they would deny it. They would spin it. Carter would use his control over my finances to lock me out of my own money before I could blink. I would be left with nothing. No. Screaming was for victims. I was not a victim anymore. I was an investigator, and I was going to be the architect of their total destruction. I unlocked my office door, pasted the tired, subservient smile back onto my face, and walked into the living room to ask Doris if she was ready for her sponge bath. Thank you for watching this far. Please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with the name of the city you live in. Every comment helps the video reach more viewers. Thank you very much. The morning after my entire reality shattered, the sun rose exactly as it always did. The alarm on my nightstand buzzed at 5 in the morning, and for a long, agonizing moment, I just stared at the ceiling. I listened to the rhythmic breathing of my husband sleeping soundly beside me. The man who had held me, kissed my forehead, and secretly plotted to leave me completely destitute. A wave of nausea hit me so hard, I had to press my hand over my mouth to keep from gagging. But I swallowed the bile down. I forced myself out of bed, tied my robe tightly around my waist, and began the performance of my life. I walked into the kitchen and started making Doris's morning oatmeal. Every stir of the spoon felt heavy. I poured the hot water, added the cinnamon she liked, and carried the bowl into the living room. Doris was already awake, sitting in her expensive hospital bed, her face twisted into her usual mask of frail suffering. As I approached, she let out a weak, theatrical groan, clutching her chest as if simply breathing was a monumental effort. Just hours ago, I had watched her waltz across the kitchen floor to eat a piece of cake. Now, she was looking at me with those pathetic, watery eyes, waiting to be served. "Good morning, Doris," I said, my voice smooth and gentle. I am so surprised by how steady I sounded. I sat on the edge of her bed and fed her the oatmeal, spoonful by spoonful. Then came the part of the routine that almost broke my composure. I had to massage her legs. I pulled back the heavy blankets and placed my hands on her calves. I pressed my fingers into her muscles, the muscles that were supposed to be dead and atrophied, but were instead firm and perfectly healthy. I felt a sick, creeping sensation crawling up my arms as I touched her. It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to dig my nails into her skin until she screamed. Instead, I rubbed her legs gently, asking her if the pressure was okay. She sighed dramatically and told me I was such a blessing. I smiled at her, a dead, empty smile, and told her it was my pleasure. While she finished her breakfast, I heard the shower running in the master bathroom. Carter was getting ready for work. This was my only window. I moved quickly and silently into his home office. Carter was arrogant. He believed I was completely technologically inept, so he rarely changed his passwords. I sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and typed in the passcode I had seen him use 100 times. The screen unlocked. My heart was pounding so loudly against my ribs I thought it might crack my chest open. I had maybe 10 minutes before the water turned off. I opened his browser history, his email, and his cloud storage, searching for the blueprint of my own destruction. What I found was worse than I ever could have imagined. I did not just find a few hidden accounts. I found an entire secondary life built on my sweat and my blood. Hidden deep within a folder disguised as insurance policies, Carter had compiled a massive digital portfolio. I opened a spreadsheet titled Florida Relocation. It detailed a beautiful, 4-bedroom house with a pool, completely paid for in cash. My cash. He had been slowly siphoning money from my business accounts for over 18 months, funneling it into a shell company he had set up under Doris's maiden name. But the most terrifying discovery was the timeline. Carter had highlighted a specific date across multiple documents, April 5th, 2026. That was only a few weeks away. I searched my own financial records to understand why that date was so crucial. Then it hit me. April 5th was the exact date my largest mutual fund, a high-yield account holding nearly $200,000 of my life savings, reached its maturity period, meaning it could be withdrawn without heavy penalty fees. He wasn't just stealing my daily income. He was waiting for the golden egg to hatch so he could steal my entire future. I kept digging, my hands flying across the trackpad. I opened a subfolder and found the fake medical bills. The motorized wheelchair that I had sold my mother's vintage ring to buy for $5,000? He had bought it used from a local charity listing for $200. He had mocked up a fake invoice to show me, pocketing the rest of the cash. The expensive, out-of-pocket physical therapists who supposedly came while I was working? They didn't exist. He had created fake letterheads and generated invoices for thousands of dollars of ghost treatments. But the final nail in the coffin was a scanned PDF labeled legal. I clicked it open and my blood ran absolutely cold. It was a comprehensive power of attorney document. It granted Carter full, unchecked legal control over all my personal and business assets in the event that I became mentally incapacitated. And at the bottom of the last page, there was my signature. It was a flawless forgery. He had practiced tracing my name until it looked exactly like mine. He was planning to declare me mentally unfit, driven crazy by the stress of caregiving, so he could legally empty my accounts on April 5th and leave me with absolutely nothing. I closed the laptop exactly as I found it just as the shower water stopped running. I walked back into the kitchen, poured Carter a cup of coffee, and handed it to him with a smile as he left for work. As the days crept closer to April 5th, Carter and Doris must have sensed a slight shift in my demeanor. No matter how perfectly I played the submissive wife, the absolute disgust I harbored for them must have leaked into the air. They realized they needed to lay the groundwork for my supposed mental breakdown to ensure the power of attorney would hold up if questioned. They decided to set the stage on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Carter casually mentioned that he had invited Brenda, our neighbor from across the hall, and the building manager over for coffee and cake. He said it was just a friendly get-together because Doris had been feeling lonely. I knew exactly what it really was. It was a live theater performance, and I was the unsuspecting villain. I baked the cake, served the coffee, and sat quietly on the sofa while Carter charmed our guests. Doris was in her wheelchair, looking exceptionally frail, draped in a thick wool blanket. About 30 minutes into the visit, the conversation subtly shifted. Carter placed a gentle, seemingly loving hand on my knee and sighed heavily. He looked at Brenda with sad, tired eyes. "I am just so worried about Caroline lately," he said, his voice dripping with fake concern. "She has been working so hard, and I think the stress is really starting to take a toll on her mind. She forgets things, she gets confused, and she has been incredibly paranoid." Brenda looked at me, her eyes full of pity and mild alarm. I just sat there, keeping my face perfectly neutral, refusing to take the bait. I knew that if I argued, if I raised my voice to defend myself, I would give them exactly what they wanted, proof of my instability. When Carter realized I wasn't reacting, he gave Doris a subtle, almost invisible nod. Right on cue, Doris gasped loudly. She grabbed the armrests of her wheelchair, let out a piercing, dramatic scream, and threw herself completely out of the chair. She hit the hardwood floor hard, thrashing her legs and crying out in fake agony. Carter jumped up, knocking over his coffee cup. "What did you do?" he shouted, glaring directly at me. "Why did you push her, Caroline?" The room exploded into chaos. Brenda gasped and covered her mouth in horror. The building manager immediately stepped between me and Doris, looking at me like I was a dangerous monster. I hadn't even moved from my spot on the sofa, but the narrative was already written. Carter knelt beside his mother, stroking her hair while she sobbed about how cruel I had been to her when no one was around. In the middle of the confusion, while Brenda ran to get wet towels, Carter leaned in close to my ear. His breath was warm, but his words were like venom. "No one will ever believe a crazy woman," he whispered. I looked down at Doris, who was peeking at me through her tears with a tiny, triumphant smirk. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They had no idea they had just handed me the match to burn their entire world down. The immediate aftermath of the Sunday theater was suffocating. I had to play their game to the absolute end. While the building manager helped lift Doris back into her chair, I buried my face in my hands and began to cry. I forced thick, desperate tears to fall. I looked at Brenda and Carter, my voice trembling, and I apologized. I told them I was just so exhausted, that my mind had been playing tricks on me, and that I didn't know what was real anymore. I begged for their forgiveness. Carter played the magnanimous, forgiving husband perfectly. He wrapped his arms around me, holding me tight while looking over my shoulder at our guests with a tragic, heroic expression. "It's okay, honey," he said softly. "We are going to get you the professional help you need." Doris sniffled from her chair, offering a weak nod of forgiveness. They were so incredibly arrogant. They bought my performance completely, believing they had thoroughly broken my spirit and secured their payout for April 5th. That night, after Carter and Doris went to sleep, I did not cry. I made a pot of black coffee, sat down at my computer, and became a machine. I had exactly 12 days left until April 5th. I took every piece of evidence I had gathered and began building 3 separate, heavily encrypted digital dossiers. The first dossier was purely visual. It contained hours of high-definition footage from the hidden cameras. Doris walking, stretching, and dancing. Carter laughing, drinking, and discussing their plans to drain my accounts. I categorized the videos by date and time, adding meticulous notes. The second dossier was financial. It contained screenshots of Carter's hidden offshore accounts, the documents for the Florida house, the fake invoices for the wheelchair, and the phantom physical therapists. I cross-referenced everything with my own bank statements to show the exact flow of stolen money. The third dossier was legal. This was the kill shot. I included the forged power of attorney document, along with side-by-side comparisons of my real signature from my passport and the fake one Carter had drawn. I saved these 3 dossiers onto 3 separate external hard drives. I hid one in the ceiling tiles of my office. I mailed the second one to a secure post office box I had rented under a fake name. The third, I uploaded to a secure cloud server that Carter didn't even know existed. I was building an airtight, inescapable vault of evidence. I was not planning a simple divorce. I was planning an annihilation. Revenge, true revenge, does not involve screaming matches or throwing clothes onto the lawn. It is administrative. It is bureaucratic. It is letting the heavy, crushing weight of the system do the dirty work for you. 9 days before April 5th, I began lighting the matches. I waited until Carter was at work and Doris was taking a nap. I opened a secure, anonymous email browser. My hands were perfectly steady. I drafted the first email to the State Department of Insurance Fraud. I did not use emotional language. I wrote like a lawyer. I detailed a 2-year-long scheme of medical fraud, attaching the videos of Doris walking and the fake invoices Carter had submitted to claim disability benefits. I hit send and watched the little paper airplane icon fly across the screen. The second email went to Adult Protective Services and the State Social Security Administration. I informed them that Doris was actively collecting severe disability benefits while fully mobile, aided and abetted by her son. I provided the cloud link to the video evidence and their exact home address. The third communication was the most crucial. I called the fraud department of my own bank. I bypassed the standard customer service lines and demanded to speak to a senior fraud investigator. I calmly explained that my husband had forged a power of attorney document and was attempting a massive, unauthorized transfer of my funds scheduled for April 5th. I sent them the proof of the forgery and the tracking numbers for the offshore accounts he had created. I instructed them to immediately freeze every single joint account we shared and to put a hard lock on my personal business accounts. When I hung up the phone, the house was completely silent. The trap was set, the triggers were pulled, and there was absolutely no way to stop the avalanche that was coming. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of iced water, and sat at the dining table. I felt lighter than I had in 9 years. I didn't have to carry the weight of their lies anymore. All I had to do now was sit back, watch the cameras, and wait for the walls to close in on them. The beauty of a bureaucratic takedown is that the targets never see the bullet coming until it has already hit them. The first tremor struck 3 days later, just 6 days before Carter's planned April 5th payday. I told Carter I was going to the grocery store to stock up on special foods for Doris. Instead, I drove 3 blocks away, parked my car in an empty lot, put my earpiece in, and opened the live camera feeds on my phone. Carter was working from home that day. I watched him sitting at the dining table, typing away on his laptop, probably counting the money he thought he was about to steal. Doris was in the kitchen, standing perfectly upright, making herself a ham sandwich. Suddenly, Carter's cell phone rang. I turned the volume up on my earpiece. I heard him answer with his usual confident, booming voice. "Hello? Yes, this is Carter." Then, there was a long pause. I watched his posture change. His shoulders stiffened. His spine went completely rigid. "Excuse me?" He stammered, his voice suddenly pitching higher. "What do you mean the accounts are frozen? By whose authority?" Doris stopped making her sandwich. She turned around, a piece of bread still in her hand, staring at Carter. "I am a joint account holder." Carter yelled into the phone, standing up so fast his chair scraped violently against the floor. "You cannot just lock me out. What fraud investigation? There is no fraud." He paced back and forth, his face turning a blotchy, panicked red. He argued with the bank representative for another 10 minutes, his voice growing increasingly desperate and aggressive, before they finally hung up on him. He threw his phone onto the couch, running his hands roughly through his hair. "What is going on?" Doris asked, dropping the bread on the counter. Her voice lacked all of its usual sickroom frailty. It was sharp with pure fear. "The bank," Carter gasped, breathing heavily. "They locked everything down. The joint checking, the savings, everything. They said they received a report of forged documents and unauthorized transfer attempts." Doris's face drained of all color. She looked incredibly old in that moment. "Did Caroline find out?" she whispered, grabbing the edge of the counter to steady herself. No, she's too stupid," Carter muttered, pacing faster. "It must be an automated audit. It has to be an error. I will fix it. I just need to call the Florida realtor and beg for an extension." But as I sat in my car, watching them panic through the screen of my phone, I knew the bank was just the beginning. The real storm was already gathering at their front door. I smiled, put my car in drive, and went to buy groceries. I needed to make sure we had plenty of snacks for the show that was about to unfold. The climax of the story did not happen in the dark, and it did not happen quietly. It happened 2 days later, at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The tension in the apartment had been unbearable. Carter was skipping work, constantly refreshing his frozen bank app on his phone, sweating through his shirts. Doris was practically living in her wheelchair again, too terrified to stand up even when I was locked in my office. Then a sharp, heavy knock echoed through the apartment. It wasn't the polite tap of a neighbor. It was the knock of authority. Carter jumped. He looked at me, his eyes wide with paranoia. I calmly walked to the door and opened it. Standing in the hallway were 3 people. 2 of them wore dark suits and carried thick leather binders. The third was wearing a medical lanyard. "Are you Caroline?" the woman in the lead asked, flashing a badge. "State Department of Insurance Fraud." This is an investigator from Adult Protective Services and a state-appointed medical evaluator. We are here regarding Doris. Carter rushed to the door, trying to block their path into the living room. What is this? He demanded, his voice cracking. You can't just barge in here. My mother is a severely disabled woman. We have a warrant to assess the living conditions and the medical state of the claimant, the investigator stated coldly, pushing past Carter without hesitation. They walked into the living room, where Doris was sitting in her wheelchair, her eyes starting around the room like a trapped animal. The medical evaluator stepped forward, opening a clipboard. Doris, we have received credible reports of medical and financial fraud regarding your disability claims, she said calmly. For our assessment, I need to ask you to try and stand up. The silence that followed was heavier than lead. It was a suffocating, terrifying silence. Doris looked at Carter, her mouth opening and closing silently. Carter looked at me, a desperate, silent plea for me to intervene, to play the protective wife, to tell them my mother-in-law was too weak. I looked back at Carter. I let the mask drop completely. The tired, subservient wife vanished. I stood up straight, crossed my arms, and met his eyes with a gaze so cold it could have frozen the sun. I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of an executioner. Go on, Doris, I said, my voice ringing out crystal clear in the quiet room. Show them how well you can dance. I'm sure your legs are feeling great today. Carter stopped breathing. The blood completely drained from his face as he stared at me, finally realizing that I knew everything. The illusion shattered instantly. Doris let out a pathetic, high-pitched wail and buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. These were not the fake tears she used to manipulate me. This was the raw, ugly crying of a criminal who knew the game was entirely over. She didn't try to stand. She just sat there, shaking. The investigators didn't need her to stand. They opened their thick leather binders and began pulling out printed screenshots of the video footage I had sent them. They showed Carter the pictures of his mother walking around the kitchen. They showed him the fake invoices for the wheelchair. And finally, the lead investigator pulled out the forged power of attorney document. You forged your wife's signature to attempt a wire fraud transfer of $200,000, the investigator stated, not as a question, but as an absolute fact. The bank has already confirmed the offshore routing numbers belong to a shell company in your mother's name. Carter completely unraveled. He turned to me, his face twisting into a mask of pure, ugly rage. He lunged across the coffee table, screaming, "You planned this. You ruined us. You crazy witch, you ruined my life." Before he could reach me, the two investigators stepped in, pushing him back forcefully against the wall. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I looked at the pathetic, sweating man I had called my husband for 9 years, and I felt nothing but absolute disgust. I didn't ruin you, Carter, I said quietly, making sure every single word landed like a physical blow. You ruined yourself. I just stopped being your shield. Now, get out of my house. Because the apartment was solely in my name, and because he was now the subject of an active criminal fraud investigation, the authorities gave Carter and Doris exactly 1 hour to pack their immediate belongings. I went to the kitchen, pulled out 2 massive black plastic trash bags, and threw them at Carter's feet. As they frantically shoved their clothes into the garbage bags, supervised by the state officials, Doris grabbed my arm one last time. Her grip was weak now. You think you've won? She hissed, her face bitter and twisted. I pulled my arm away, brushing my sleeve as if she had dirted it. This isn't about winning, Doris, I replied. This is just the truth finally catching up to you. When the front door closed behind them, I immediately called an emergency locksmith. Within an hour, the locks were changed. The heavy hospital bed was dismantled and thrown into the dumpster. The house was mine again. 3 weeks later, the apartment felt entirely different. It felt lighter, cleaner, as if the walls themselves had finally exhaled a breath they had been holding for 2 years. The smell of antiseptic and baby powder was gone, replaced by the scent of fresh coffee and open windows. The legal fallout was swift and merciless. Because Carter had attempted to move funds across state lines to Florida using forged legal documents, he was hit with multiple federal charges for identity theft and wire fraud. He lost his job immediately. His corporate career was over. Doris was permanently blacklisted from all state medical assistance programs. The state was aggressively pursuing her for the repayment of 2 years' worth of fraudulent disability checks. They were completely ruined, living in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, awaiting trial. April 5th came and went, and my money remained safely secured in my accounts. The final twist came in a plain white envelope tucked under my door. It was a formal letter from the building management company. During the initial police investigation, the management had reviewed months of security footage from the building's common areas and parking garage. They sent me a flash drive containing footage I hadn't even asked for. It showed Carter, on multiple occasions over the last 2 years, effortlessly picking up Doris's heavy motorized wheelchair and tossing it into the trunk of his car with one hand. No ramps, no struggle, no assistance needed. The management terminated his access to the building permanently, citing safety concerns and criminal activity on the premises. That same afternoon, there was a soft knock on my door. It was Brenda, the neighbor from across the hall. She was holding a cup of coffee from the expensive cafe down the street. She looked at me with deep shame in her eyes. "Oh my God, Caroline," she said softly, handing me the coffee. "I saw the police. I heard about the fraud. I am so incredibly sorry. I cannot believe they acted like that. I cannot believe I thought you were the one losing your mind." I took the coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my hands. I smiled at her, a real, genuine smile for the first time in months. "It's okay, Brenda," I said. "Some people are just really good at faking weakness to control others." I closed the door, walked into my bright, quiet living room, and sat down. I had lost 9 years of my life to a lie. I had sacrificed my body, my sanity, and almost my future for people who viewed me as nothing more than an ATM machine. But I hadn't let them destroy me. I learned that true strength isn't about suffering in silence. True strength is knowing exactly when to stop being silent and letting the brutal, unapologetic truth do the talking. So Reddit, after letting my husband and his mother destroy their own lives, face federal fraud charges, and lose absolutely everything just days before April 5th, am I the jerk for not giving them a warning, or was this the exact justice they deserved? Thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button and ring the bell for more insane family drama stories. See you in the next one.